Matthew Lloyd says, if the right to keep and bear arms extends to weapons the founding fathers didn't have, why does it does it not extend to tanks, fighter planes, and nuclear weapons? What's the definition of arms? That's a great question, and it's something I've thought about an awful lot. There are two things you can say about this. One of them is, the simple one is, you should have the right to keep and bear whatever arms are going to be used against you. I think that's a pretty compelling argument. If the entire purpose of the Second Amendment is to defend you from the government, defend you from people telling you what to do, forcing you to do things at the point of a gun, if giving the power of a firearm to individual people is to stop encroachment on their liberties, then you have to ask yourself, what are the encroachers going to be coming at you with? And they're not going to be coming at you with muskets. And unfortunately, they're not going to be coming at you with just AKs or AR-15s either. They're going to be coming at you with tanks, and they're going to be coming at you with drones, and they're going to be coming at you with all kinds of things. So I think ethically, you should have the ability to defend yourself against the government, and that means you should be allowed to have whatever weapons are necessary to stop it. And that means anti-tank weapons. It means, bazookas. It means tanks. Can you own your own tank? I say, oh yes, you can own your own tank. Now, the question is, how far up can you run this? And the question is, can you run this, to example, for nuclear weapons? Should everybody be allowed to have a nuclear weapon? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. And this has to do with something, and I cannot for the life of me remember where I read it. I just can't. I wish I could. But this is a common problem for me. But basically the argument is that a nuclear weapon raises the level of ambient risk to make it too intolerable. Ambient risk. What does that mean? Well, we know when we get up in the morning that we're taking a risk. We're going to go outside. We're going to get in our car. We're going to drive around. We're going to... all these activities involve risk. You could fall down the stairs. You could get hit by a car, killed by a bus. You can have a heart attack. You can have all these things. But this is the risk that we all accept. This is a very low ambient level of risk in this society anyway, extremely low. And we all have to endure it. So on some level, it's like a 1 atmosphere, oxygen. It's like 1 atmosphere of air, or it's like 1 g of gravity. It's what we grew up with. Ambient risk is ambient risk, and as long as nobody disturbs the ambient risk, then so far so good. Now, if somebody decided to shoot somebody with a firearm, that would be alarming to the person being shot at. And needless to say, their level of risk would go up, but the ambient risk would not. The overall ambient risk of a society would not really go up based on something like that. But with a nuclear weapon, it would. You would then have millions of people whose lives are dependent upon the sanity of the person owning that weapon. And it's not a question of encroachment, because a guy has a nuclear weapon, let's say a real one. Let's say he's got an H-bomb. He's got a megaton H-bomb in his apartment in Sherman Oaks, down in the closet. And he's got a button to pull that any single time. And so now the fate of millions of people depend on this person's sanity, this person's resilience. There depends on all of it. And that is not an acceptable level of ambient risk, especially when it's one individual. Right now we have that same kind of thing with governments. I mean, right this second here in Sherman Oaks, it's possible that the Russians or the Chinese or the French or the British or the Indians could just decide to nuke this building. But since there are so many safeguards there, the ambient risk of that is very low. Give it to an individual and the ambient risk becomes higher and intolerable. And a better way to think about this, I heard this as part of the example. And basically somebody said, if you go into a bar, let's say at nighttime, and you go into the bar and there are people there that have concealed carry permits, you're still at a more or less ambient level of risk. You wouldn't even know they have them. And since they tend to be responsible people, nothing's going to happen because nobody's going to draw a weapon and so on. But if somebody points a gun at you, now your risk level is intolerably high. You cannot simply abide this. You can't simply say, oh, well, I'm just going to go on with this person pointing a gun at my head for the rest of my life. And my entire life is dependent on whether or not this person decides to take my life or not. That's not acceptable level of risk. That's why my dad told me very early, and took me a long, long time to understand. Long, long, long time. He said, if you point a gun at somebody, you better shoot him. And I couldn't understand it. I could not until I did. Which is, when you point a gun at somebody, you have threatened them. You have basically put their lives into your hands, and they have every single right in the world to get their life out of your hands. So if you're going to point a gun at somebody, you better shoot him, because if you don't, he's going to come after you. And I think that's completely appropriate. Somebody points a gun at me, and I'm holding a beer bottle, and then they turn around for a minute or bend over to tie their shoelaces. I'm going to smash the guy on the head. I'm not going to do that if he's got a concealed carry permit. See how it works? So if the guy's behaving himself, minding his own business, got a concealed carry permit, I'm not going to knock the guy out and disarm him. But if the guy points a gun at me and then he bends down to tie his shoelaces, then I'm going to knock him out. I'm going to take his gun and we'll arrest him, because that kind of behavior has made unacceptable risk. So I think you basically have to kind of parse this out and say that, to me, AR-15 is not raising the ambient risk. If you have one and you live next door to me, that doesn't really raise the risk of me, certainly doesn't raise the risk of the people in the next 10, 20 mile radius. If you have a tank, you probably raise the risk a little bit, but again, not so much, But if you have a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon, then everybody has an ambient risk level so high, then you are essentially pointing a gun at people's head, and they have to hope that you're going to be rational enough to not kill them. And that's not something you should have to do. You're taking somebody's, you are adding so much risk to that individual that the individual has a right to respond and to and reduce it back to the ambient level. Okay, that's good.